So good afternoon and welcome to Archives at the American Jewish Historical Society. My name is Annie Polland and I'm the executive director, and it is really exciting to be with you. And we're not with you in your homes, but in the last few weeks, me and the archivists have come back to the Center for Jewish History where we're located. And it's been after 4 months or so, it was really nice to come back and be reunited with our collections, the collections that we have, over 30 million documents, 50,000 books. That's really the heart of what we do. Is we have these archives, we have these collections, and our goal is to share them with you. And we're kind of using COVID, I guess, as an opportunity to create this series, to bring you close up and let you see elements of our archive in ways that are more accessible than even if you were to be standing right there in the archive with us, because you're gonna be able to see some documents close up that you wouldn't otherwise see. So the first object that we picked to look at is one that we are known for already. It's the red book that you can see, with the marbleized cover. And this is a kind of what was a blank notebook that Emma Lazarus purchased, most likely before a trip she took to Europe in the mid-1880s. And what she eventually did was write her poetry, write her work out in this book. At the time she wrote the poetry in this book, and there's about 161 pages filled with poems that she had been writing over the course of her career. Emma Lazarus had started writing poetry as a young girl. She was born in 1849, just a few blocks from here on 14th Street near Union Square. And she started writing really early on. And in her mid-30s, she became ill. And when she was in Europe, I think she realized that she might not have long to live. And that provided her with the opportunity, or it gave her the impetus to write out her work. Now, I'm going to open this up and let you see a little bit inside. You can see it says Original Poems by Emma Lazarus. That's her handwriting. And I'm going to move this. And you can see on the first page is the New Colossus. Now, the New Colossus is a poem that Emma Lazarus became famous for. But when she wrote this in 1883, the poem became noted. But by 1886, when the Statue of Liberty was installed in New York's harbor, no mention was made of this poem. And really no mention was really made of immigration, which was what the poem was about. It wouldn't be until 1903 that the poem is put on the statue. And even a few decades later, that the poem achieves the kind of renown that it is, that it's taught in schools, that it's in textbooks, and things like that. That's really not until the 1930s. But Emma Lazarus knew, even at a time that people had kind of forgotten her poem, she knew it was her most important poem, and she placed it first in this book. And that gives us a sense, again, of why this book is so important, because she's putting her poetry in the order that was important to her. We have insight on what she valued. And at the American Jewish Historical Society, we've spent the last year or 2 years talking a lot about this poem. We have a poetry contest that we urge you to enter. We have curriculum that we urge you to use. And we even have a short documentary about Emma Lazarus that you can look at, and we'll post all of this at the end. But for this show tonight, or today, we're going to focus on what's on page 2. What was the second most important poem to her? And I'm going to turn the page and also shift the camera a little bit so you can see better. All right. So this is a poem called Progress and Poverty that she wrote in 1881, October 2nd, 1881, or thereabouts. And you can see at the bottom that it says printed in the New York Times, October 2nd, 1881. So we know that this poem reached a wide audience when it was written. And then at the top, it says Progress and Poverty, and then in parentheses, after reading Mr. Henry George's book. So before we go into the heart of the poem itself, it's important for us to look at who Henry George was and what was his book, because Emma Lazarus read many, many, many books, but she didn't write poems about each one. So what was it about Henry George? What was it about this book, Progress and Poverty, that motivated her not only to write a poem, but write a poem that would then be published in the New York Times catching the attention later of Henry George. So in brief, Henry George was a journalist. In the 1870s, he became, when there was a Great Depression, it was the Great Depression in the 1870s, it was a Panic of 1873, we now call it in textbooks, but he saw tremendous poverty. At the same time, he was seeing a lot of innovation. So he started to wonder, how could there be progress and also poverty? And even though he only had a 6th grade education, he studied and learned so that he ended up writing and published in 1879 a 500-page book. And this is the book that caught Emma Lazarus's attention. One side note about Henry George is that most of the people who paid attention to him, and again, he got wide attention eventually, but the people who were most interested in what Henry George had to say were the workers themselves. And they rallied around him. And in 1886, he actually ran for mayor of New York as part of the Central Labor Union. And he came in second in a 3-way race. Abram Hewitt won, but Henry George beat out a very young Theodore Roosevelt. So anyways, that's a side note about Henry George, and he would eventually, lots of people, the book ended up selling out, being reprinted. People like Leo Tolstoy read it, and so did Albert Einstein praised it. But Emma Lazarus was one of the first people early on who came from the upper classes to really grapple with his message. So to find out more about Henry George, we actually spoke to Professor Ed O'Donnell from Trinity College, and he is the author of a biography of Henry George. And so now we're going to shift a little bit to a short clip, a recording of Ed O'Donnell talking about the essence of Henry George, and we'll come back. So
at that time, he decides that he's looking around at this Gilded Age and saying, acknowledging the wonders of the age. It's an incredible era of wealth creation and also new technology, mind-blowing new technology. The Transcontinental Railroad has just been completed. There's things like electricity and light bulbs illuminating cities, the phonograph, and in New York City, the Brooklyn Bridge will be, the great technological wonder of its age in the 1880s. All of that's happening in the 1870s. But George is perceptive enough to notice, as are some other people, that along with all this progress seems to be a lot of social unrest, a lot of misery, a lot of poverty. And he says, why is this so? Why would we have so much progress? And wouldn't that mean that we would leave poverty behind, or it would diminish almost to the point of disappearance? But somehow it's not. It seems to be getting worse. Inequality is an evil, and it's not inevitable, but if it is unchecked, it will destroy democracy. It is as simple as that you cannot continue to go in a society where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. At a certain point, it reaches a breaking point, and you will not have democracy. And he one of his ways he puts it, he says, just because somebody has the right to vote, but he's working 100 hours a week and his family is starving, he's not free.
So now that we know a little bit more about Henry George and a little bit more about the central argument of his book, Progress and Poverty, we're ready to hear the poem. And we're going to turn to Professor Schor, a Princeton professor and author of the magisterial biography about Emma Lazarus, entitled simply Emma Lazarus.
It's called Progress and Poverty, and in parentheses, after reading Mr. Henry George's book. O splendid age, when science lights her lamp at the brief lightning's momentary flame, fixing it steadfast as a star, man's name upon the very brow of heaven to stamp, launched on a ship whose iron cuirass sides mock storm and wave. Humanity sails free, gaily upon a vast, untraveled sea, or pathless wastes, to ports undreamed she rides, richer than Cleopatra's barge of gold, this vessel manned by demigods with freight of priceless marvels. But where yawns the hold in that deep, reeking hell? What slaves be they who feed the ravenous monster, pant and sweat, nor know if overhead rain night or day? It's a poem that has a lot of images that would come to fruition in the sonnet on the Statue of Liberty, the new Colossus. This idea of science lighting her lamp, the idea of an enlightenment that's a kind of false enlightenment or a stunted enlightenment, a partial enlightenment. And in the poem, we have the contradiction, the contrast between this enlightened world above board on the deck of the ship and this deep reeking hell in which the galley slaves are rowing and feeding this ravenous monster, the monster being both the ship and also the monster of capitalism and wealth, predatory wealth. So I think she identified with these people who dance and sing on this vast untraveled sea. She herself was yet to do her own sea traveling, but she would enjoy 2 trips to Europe in the next few years. She uses imagery from Shelley and Keats and Shakespeare. I mean, it's imagery from the elite tradition of English poetry, Shakespeare and the sonnet tradition. It's a Petrarchan sonnet. I mean, it's in a very high elite form. But the idea is that the people working to allow this kind of celebration of culture and enlightenment are in fact enslaved to this system. And she uses the word slaves, and that's not a Henry George word. I mean, Henry George was interested in class and worker and labor. But I think there's a self-consciousness here because she knew that her money was made on the backs of slaves. And I think Emma Lazarus was quite aware of that the sugar business depended on slave labor.
To better understand the world Emma Lazarus lived in and the social classes that encircled her, we're going to go to her home on West 10th Street, just a few blocks away from the archives. So we're here at 18 West 10th Street, and this is where Emma Lazarus lived in the last years of her life. In the 1880s, she would write the new Colossus while she lived here, and even before she lived in this particular brownstone, she would have lived in brownstones like this. And the point we want to convey here is that Emma Lazarus had many opportunities and many cultural opportunities as well. And in the earlier part of her life, she really thought that the answer to a lot of the social questions came through art. You know, she thought if people could be exposed to art, literature, and music, that would help, you know, bring the world to a better place. And I think reading Progress and Poverty was kind of this, to some extent, an awakening, but one in which that crystallized a lot of the ideas that she must have had and impressions she would have had by living in this neighborhood. Because even though today this is a sheltered, shady, beautiful street, going just a few blocks would have put her into a tenement district, or going a few blocks would have her at Union Square, where there were labor demonstrations regularly. So this is where Emma Lazarus is kind of coming to terms with a society in which there is both progress and poverty.
And she wrote George's remarkable letter. I'll just read a little bit from it. She said, "Your work is not so much a book as an event. The life and thought of no one capable of understanding it can be quite the same after reading it. For once prove the indisputable truth of your idea, and no person who prizes justice or common honesty can dine or sleep or read or work in peace until the monstrous wrong in which we are all accomplices be done away with." So I think in that quote is the germ of this poem, which is about all of the kind of unconsciousness with which privileged Americans, or even middle-class, comfortable Americans, went on with their daily life and their creature comforts and their cultural joys in the face of poverty.
So we heard a little bit about what Emma thought about Henry George and Progress and Poverty, but we also wanted to give you a sense of how excited Henry George was to have this poet breathe life into his 500-page economic book. And so what he says, he writes to her, "If I cannot sing myself, I have at least been the means of inspiring one who can." So he was clearly enthralled with this poet who loved his words and even tried to kind of recruit her to the broader social causes of the time, which she was interested in. But what would happen soon thereafter is the arrival of East European Jews fleeing pogroms, looking for economic opportunity, and coming in huge numbers. And Emma's attention was going to be directed towards them, and it would be that experience that then leads her to write the new Colossus. But as we see this poem, we go back to this book and we see how progress and poverty comes second. So clearly, Henry George, progress and poverty, the issues that he talked about, the realizations she was making, made it an indelible imprint on her. And again, the book is the testimony to that idea. We're going to find out more about this book as we go to Director of Collections and Engagement, Melanie Myers.
Good afternoon. So I'm the Director of Collections and Engagement at the American Jewish Historical Society, where I'm really fortunate every day that I get to work with such incredibly beautiful materials, such an incredibly rich archive, the crown jewel of which is clearly Emma Lazarus's beautiful red book. But unlike the learned people that came before me who really are talking about the content and the interpretation of the content, one of my jobs and one of my interests is looking at the book as an artifact. What is the life cycle of the object, right? How do we describe it physically, but also where did it come from? How did we get it? So I got to indulge in a little provenance research when thinking about this object while we were preparing for this program. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you in terms of how people like myself do research into these kind of objects, which is a bit different. So the first thing we wanted to find out is how exactly did we get this object? How did it come to us? Was it donated by the family, as so many materials that we get here are? And we know the Lazarus collection, which is collection number P2, for those of you who would like to find it in the online search portal, was assembled from a variety of donations from different family members and different sources. So one of the things I did, as I thought as a starting spot, is I went analog. I went a bit old school. That's right. I pulled out a drawer from the card catalog, everyone. We do still have our card catalog here, and while most of the information there is available digitally, one of the great things about a card catalog is that frequently the intrepid librarians who had my job 50, 60, 70 years ago would sometimes make notes on the cards that don't always make it into the digital record. And a lot of times those refer to internal files, donor files, and information about provenance. So when I look at the card, and unfortunately you can't really see it on the screen here, but it says what's in the collection. And it says, first thing, item number 1 is an original manuscript notebook of her poetry. There's also a scrapbook. And then there's assorted other items, a signed poem, a print of the new Colossus with some really nice artwork. But it doesn't specifically say where each thing comes from. It lists 2 separate donors, one of which we now know was Mrs. Julian Wolfe, who is a cousin of Emma Lazarus, who was actually born in Nathan, I believe. And she donated the scrapbook in 1904 or 1905. And this is exactly the kind of thing you would expect a cousin to have created or held on to. It is a scrapbook of obituaries, of articles written about Emma Lazarus, of condolence notes. So it's the kind of thing you would expect that a family member would transmit to the American Jewish Historical Society. So then we have some other things that are mentioned. Again, this, these sort of various autographs and whatnot. And those we know came from the Philip and Elsie Sang Foundation, who donated a very large collection of Judaica to the AJHS in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So I thought to myself, the book probably got donated with either the scrapbook or with the Sang materials, and maybe we just made a mistake and it wasn't correctly noted on the card, or somehow you make a small mistake like that and then it gets reproduced in all this other paperwork going forward. So I pulled the Sang donor file, and so the card catalog led me to the donor file, and I discovered that while the Sangs gave us an enormous amount of incredibly beautiful Judaica over time, the Emma Lazarus manuscript book was not itemized in the Sang donations, of which there were 3 different ones. All of the other Emma Lazarus items, and I'll hold it up, but you can't really see it very well, are clearly noted as, and we also did an extremely nice catalog of the other materials that they donated as well. So now I'm thinking to myself, this must be written down somewhere. We're going to have to do a deeper dive. So I then said, I'm going to go to the AJHS Institutional Archive. And we are also fortunate in that AJHS really seemed to have a sense of our own history right from the beginning, and as such saved an enormous amount of the documentation over our 120, 130 years of operation that I was able to refer back to. So the first place I went to is what are called the accession files. And the accession notebooks, and I'll hold it up, again, it's a little hard to see, but you can see these are just handwritten ledgers that talk about what is accessioned into the collection. And accession is basically the formal act of bringing material into the collection. What I discovered is that what is incredibly carefully itemized in this ledger are books. And by books, I mean printed books, published books, not manuscript materials, not paintings, not any of the other materials that AJHS was also acquiring, but these were left for strictly books. So then I said, all right, I'm still puzzled here. How is it we find no mention? There's no mention of this book anywhere. It's not in the accession ledgers. It's not in the donor files. Where could I find some more information? And so I then went back again to the AJHS Institutional Archive. And what I was able to find is minutes from various committee meetings, internal correspondence in archival files, just like this. And I found one from 1937, which contained a very cryptic note which caught my attention. And what the librarian is doing is they're telling the leadership of the AJHS what non-book items have been donated or purchased. And at the very end, there's a note about Miss Blanche Moses of New York City, who donated more materials for her family archive. Blanche Moses was also a member of an extremely established and well-to-do New York City Jewish family. She was never married, and as such became a bit of a de facto family historian and keeper of the family flame, and donated a really beautiful collection of objects over the years to the AJHS. And so it itemizes these things that she gives, and then here comes the part that got my attention. It says, besides, we've received many portraits, a most generous gift. Included also is the red book, which is in quotes, the value of which you know. And Miss Moses does not wish this gift to be made public. Could this be Emma Lazarus's red book? Don't we have other red books? Couldn't she be referring to a different red book? That's also possible. But there's one thing that leads me to believe, again, I cannot prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it is plausible that the way that Blanche Moses would have ended up with Emma Lazarus's book is because she was Emma Lazarus's cousin. She was Emma Lazarus's first cousin. And again, we can see from the various items that she donated to AJHS over the years that she clearly was very interested in her family and genealogy, and went to great lengths to preserve the family legacy and to donate it to the AJHS. Why was it supposed to be a secret? That I'm not sure. I'm still searching for the answer to that. I'm still searching for more information than what we found in these cryptic notes. And I hope to be able to come back to everyone else later with an answer to this question. But suffice it to say, it's been an interesting journey to be able to get there, to be able to look through our institutional archive and look at the way that AJHS has acquired objects over the years, how we relied on many families to give us these historic and important materials that we have here today. And as I said, that I am extremely fortunate to be able to work with every day here.
Thank you, Melanie. And one of the things that strikes me about that book and the way in which it very likely came from a family member is that so many of our family collections come from families, and specifically from, there's always like one individual in a family that seems to be most interested in preserving things, keeping the photographs. It's like that one branch. And is that that's something I've noticed. I'm wondering, Melanie, if that is something that you have seen as well.
I think it's especially true in these very early collections that we got, because when you look at the curator's reports, a lot of the non-book items, again, the manuscript materials, the letters, paintings were donated by women, particularly daughters, granddaughters, who ended up, like I said, being the sort of the family historians, or who maybe just had a vested interest in getting these things out to AJHS. But they certainly value of it, I think.
And especially in the early years, so many of the collections that came to us were from families. And I think it's just a reminder to all of you out there that archives are what people give to them often. I mean, there are some archives that can purchase things, and that happens once in a while, but for the most part, you're really looking outside to get the contributions, to get the donations of the materials. And so what you all think is history and give to us is incredibly important in shaping what that history becomes. We're live here. We're happy to take your questions. One thing I'll say too is that I think one of the reasons why Emma Lazarus is so interesting to us is because with Esther Schor, who's written this wonderful book, you can see we've used it a lot. She talks about how she was ahead of her time. And I think she was probably the most famous Jewish person to speak as a Jewish person. So there had been other people that had become politicians or lawyers or different things, but Emma Lazarus delved into Jewish history, and she spoke about being Jewish and as a Jew. And I think that was interesting, and that she was also just really ahead of her time. And I think in this particular case, as we delved into progress and poverty, what we were able to see was her own realizations, like that she could kind of admit maybe she hadn't had partial view of things, and that society was more complicated than she might have thought. And that letter that she writes to Henry George about acknowledging where she comes from and working towards a better society, I think is really important. And what I'd like to think is that was her own grounding in history and in her roots that enabled her to question and to be open to new ideas and new ways of looking at things as well. Someone had asked, oh, go ahead.
There's actually a question that goes directly to that, which is, when did the Lazarus family come to America?
Yeah, and the Lazarus family came really early, in the early 1700s. So her great-grandmother, Grace Mendez-Seixas, was born in New York. So Emma Lazarus is really fifth generation. And the family descended from originally people who had fled Portugal, had gone to various places. And then also one branch of the family, I believe, is from Central Europe. But Emma Lazarus is both Sephardi and Ashkenazi, but is often called Sephardic Jew, a Sephardic Jew because the kind of dominant norms of the Jewish community were shaped by the early settlers who were Sephardic. And so even well into the 1800s, when there were more Ashkenazi congregants of Shearith Israel, they still adhered to the Sephardic rite. But so Emma Lazarus her family comes in the early 1700s, but she is very well established as an by 1849. There's a question too about, it says, shame on anyone who refers to capitalism as a monster. So just to clarify, Emma Lazarus and also Henry George, I don't think that they were critics of, that they wanted capitalism overthrown at all. In fact, it's a lot of socialists would claim Henry George, but I don't think he himself would have called himself a socialist. He believed in the free market for the most part, but he just thought that there should be a tax on land, and believed that there should be more taxes on land, and specifically when land values change, and to have that fund more of the public good. But I don't think he was about, a revolution or turning over totally of capitalism. And I don't think Emma Lazarus was either. But yeah, and I think, I think it was mostly for Emma Lazarus, it was realizing, wow, her whole position came from the fact that her father had made money, and he had made money as a sugar refiner. And sugar refiners depended, for the most part, on the labor of enslaved workers. So I think part of this, as Esther Schor notes, part of her reading of Progress and Poverty is also the realization of kind of of where her own wealth had come from, and coming to terms with that. And the question is the Red Book, the book of poems, what was the last name of the relative who gave the Red Book? We don't know for sure, but we think it was Blanche Moses, who was, I don't believe she was a first cousin, but she was like some kind of cousin, but they were a contemporary. She was about 10 years younger than Emma Lazarus, but her great-grandfather was Gershom Mendez-Seixas, and Emma's great-grandmother was the sister of Gershom Mendez-Seixas, who was also leader of Shearith Israel.
So someone has her own files? Yes, she does. She donated the Moses family files, but some of that is also material about herself, as well as her own detailed genealogical research about her family. which was very unusual. And she donated them in the 40s, and genealogy was much, much harder to do then. Like, there's no ancestry, where you could just type it in and come up with a list of files. Doing genealogy prior to mass digitization was very detail-oriented work that required going through a lot of paper documents and really trying to trace that back in a granular way. And she did a lot of that work for her own family. She clearly valued her own family history. That is apparent, which is, again, we are not sure that she gave it, but that little cryptic note there about the red book that they know the value of gives us pause and makes us wonder, there's a bigger story there regardless, I think. Is it this red book or is it a different red book? But I think it's the one that's on your desk. So
I think it is too. And also, one thing about Blanche Moses is in her own family collection, there's a great new book out called The Art of the Family by Laura Liebman. And she has a lot of material that comes from the Moses family. And perhaps for me, the most interesting thing was to learn that we had an ivory portrait of a woman named Sarah Brandon Moses. And Sarah Brandon Moses was the grandmother of Blanche Moses, who we think gave us the Red Book. Anyways, Sarah Brandon Moses, we know through Laura Liebman, was actually born enslaved in Barbados and had a Jewish father who bought her out of slavery, gave her an education, and she then married into a prominent New York family, the Moses. And Blanche Moses didn't know that. And this is something that Laura Liebman's amazing research has pulled out. So there are, the great thing about the archive is that you might have something in the archive for years and a historian comes and finds something new about it. And so everything is always evolving, and often it's questions that people ask that spur historians to ask more questions, which is why we're doing this whole show in the first place. And we'll be back to you next time in a few weeks with a segment on GI Jews, Jewish soldiers who fought in World War II. And we'll have some others on food, on civil rights, the Soviet Jewry movement, Jews and crime. So follow us and you'll find out more information about more of these live from the archives. And we appreciate your patience with us as we did our first one. And I want to do a huge shout out to Chelsea Bracci, who made all of this happen. I don't know how to use a document worker. I barely know how to use Zoom, and Chelsea helped us. So thank you, Chelsea, for all your amazing work. Thank you to Ed O'Donnell, Esther Schor, and thank you so much to Melanie, who makes our archives and our libraries so wonderful. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.